Hi friends, welcome to Azure Content. This is part 18 in Mapping Data Flow Scenarios playlist. In this video, we are going to learn how to combine column names and column values coming from two different files into single file using Mapping Data Flow. So let's see the requirement in details. So as you can see, we have two input files. Okay, both of them are of JSON format. So the first file is having an array called fields, and inside this fields array we have couple of JSONs present as the item of array. Okay, so this is one item of array, so this is another item of array. So similarly we have 5 JSONs as the item of array, and if you closely observe, each JSON is having two key value pair, where display name is having the data which we need as the output column name. Okay, as you can see, record ID should be one column name, created date time should be another column name, created by should be third column name, similarly created by ID and last modified date time we want as the output column names. Okay, now this field ID is nothing but, if you see the other file, field ID is the common column or common property between the first file and the second file. Okay, so basically we want to join these two files based on the field ID, and wherever the field ID matches, if you see this field ID and this field ID matches, so this column should have this value, okay, assigned to it. Similarly, on the basis of field ID we will join these two files, and if you see 1002 should be joined, and created date time should be getting this value as the output. Okay, similarly we should have created by as the column name, and James Bond should be the value for that. Okay, similarly created by ID should have 007 because it is getting joined on field ID 1004. Okay, similarly last modified date time should have this value as the output, as it is getting joined based on the field ID. Okay, so how to achieve this? Using mapping data flow. So let's see. Okay, now let me go to Azure portal, and in my Azure data lake storage I have the two input files. Let me show you the JSON files one by one. So this is the first JSON file as I shown you in the presentation. Let me clear it. So you can see this is the same file that we have here. Okay, so this is good. Now coming to second input file. So as you can see, this is the same data as we have in second file. Okay, so we have to take these two as the source data in our mapping data flow, and we have to get this data as the output JSON file. Okay, so let's start creating the data flow. Let me go to ADF portal and let me hit on new data flow. So I have already turned my data flow debug option as on, so that we can preview the data while creating the data flow. Okay, now as we have two source files as the input files, so let me add two sources. Okay, so in the first source let me create a data set pointing to JSON1. so let me select JSON as the format, let me select the linked service pointing to ADLS, and here my data is in Anu demo folder. Okay, so let me select the first JSON file, let me import schema as well, and let me hit on OK. Now let me preview the data. So we are getting an error saying malformed records. Why? Because the JSON, if you see, it is having an array. So basically the format of this data is array of document. So let me go to source option, and here in JSON settings let me select array of document, and now let me preview the data. Yeah, so our data is visible. Since this field ID is an array, so it is returning the data as an array format. You can see each of the item of array is visible if we expand it. Okay, so we are good. Now let me go to source 2 and let me create a data set pointing to the second JSON file. Let me select JSON format, and let me browse to Anu demo folder and JSON2. Okay, now let me preview the data. Now again we are getting this error because this time if you see the data, it is in a single format, in a single document. Okay, so this is just one simple JSON. So because of that we need to select single document, not document per line, which is the default value. So now let me go to data preview and again let me hit on refresh. Yeah, so the data is clearly visible now. So now we have to join these field ID values with the field ID present in source. Okay, so since this data is a complex data, let me flatten it and let me convert it into individual rows. Okay, so let me select field array to unroll by, and here let me select display name and let me select field ID, which will give these two as the output column names. Okay, so here I want display name as the output column and field ID is correct. Let me hit on refresh for data preview. Yeah, so the data has been converted in tabular structure now. Now we have to join these two files based on the field ID column. So how to do this? Since in the source 2 these field ID values are present in column name, so we want to convert it into row values so that we can join these two columns of the two files. Okay, so to convert column into rows we have to unpivot the data. Okay, so here we need to introduce the concept of unpivot transformation. Okay, so I have already talked about pivot transformation and unpivot transformation in our previous videos, so please go through each of the videos one by one. So let me give a brief idea about pivot and unpivot transformation again, so that it will be clear when you go through this video. So let me go to whiteboard and let me start giving the same example that we have already talked about in previous videos. So suppose we have a data like this, we have fruits column and we have quantity column. Okay, and suppose on day 1 we are getting 10 apples. Okay, and on same day we are getting mango, suppose 20 mangoes. Okay, now other day we are getting 30 apples and again we are getting suppose 10 mango. Okay, now we have to convert these apple and mango values into column instead of rows. So we have to basically pivot the data. When we are converting row value into column, then we are basically pivoting the data. So we will pivot based on fruits column. So we will group by using fruits column. So basically we need one column to group by in case of pivot. Okay, so we will group by using this fruit column, and then we have to use sum function, that is an aggregate function, to sum up the value or the quantity of apple. Okay, so in this case it will be 40 for apple and then mango will be 20 plus 10, that is 30. Okay, so basically for pivoting we need a column to group by and also we need an aggregate function to get the output. Okay, now suppose we had to do the other way round, that means we had apple and mango as the column names and we had to convert it into row values, then of course we need to ungroup it using some column. If we don't have any column, we will introduce a dummy column and we will ungroup it using this column. Okay, and also we need some aggregate function to ungroup. Okay, so this concept of converting column name into row values is nothing but unpivoting the data. Okay, so now let me go back. So here we need to unpivot the data because we are converting the column names into row values. Okay, so let me select unpivot data, and here as I told we have to ungroup using some column. So we don't have any column which we can use to ungroup it. So let me introduce something called surrogate key and let me give a dummy column, suppose ID. Let me preview the data. It will basically generate an identity column that will be associated with each row. Now since we have only one row, so it will generate ID 1. Okay, if we would have multiple rows, it will generate ID on ascending order 1, 2, 3, 4 based on this step value. If we give 10 as the step value, then the first row will be 1, then second row will be 11, because it will keep on adding this step value to the next row. Okay, so let me leave it like that. Now let me go to unpivot transformation, and here let me select ID to ungroup by. Okay, now unpivot key. So here we need to mention, while converting from this data to this data, what should be this column name. Okay, since earlier this was the column name and we are converting into the column value or the row value, and we are converting into the row value. So what will be the new column name that we are going to give it? So let me give a dummy column name, suppose new column. Okay, and here the type of the column will be string. Okay, now let me go to unpivoted columns. So here we need to give the column name for this data, that means corresponding to each row values whatever data we will have. So let me give the column name as data. Okay, that will hold this particular data whatever we have here. Okay, so let me give the column name as data. Now let me preview it. Yeah, so you can see the data is visible. So we have converted this column names into the row values. Okay, and also these are coming as the corresponding values inside this data column. Okay, so now we can join this new column with this field ID, right, as we have the common column between them. So let me add join transformation here, and let me give the right stream as flatten 1. Okay, and here from the left stream, the column which we need to use in the join is new column, and in the right it is field ID. Okay, now since this new column is having some prefix, that is field ID colon, which is not there in this field ID, so we have to substring the value of this new column. Okay, so what we can do is we can use either substring, that will be a long query. Instead of that, I am going to use split function that will split the data based on the delimiter that we provide. So as you can see in this example, if we give split function to these values based on the comma separated value, as we are giving delimiter as comma, so it will give individual values as the item of array. Okay, then we can pick any of the values that we want. Okay, so let me use this split function, and since it is splitted by colon, so I am giving it as delimiter, and we have to give array of 2 because we want the second part of the new column. So this whole data will be divided into 2 item of array, and we want the second value of it. Okay, so now let me preview the data. Yeah, so the data is visible now. You can see join is happening based on this new column and field ID. Okay, so wherever there is a matching condition, we are getting the output. Okay, so since all of the data are matching, it is giving all 5 records. Now since we don't want new column and field ID, let me remove it using select transformation. Okay, so let me remove new column and field ID, on the basis of which we have performed this join. Yeah, so you can correlate the data with the output that we want. So you can see we are getting record ID and its corresponding value. Okay, and created date time, its corresponding value. So we are good. Now what we need to do is we need to convert these values again into the form of column. Okay, so we need to convert row values into column names now. Okay, so this time we will use pivot transformation. Okay, so again I am going to use ID column for grouping the data. Now in the pivot key we have to provide the column that is holding the row values that we want to convert it into column names. Okay, so since we want these values to be converted as the column names, so we have to provide this display name as the pivot key. Okay, so let me provide that. Now in the pivoted columns we have to provide an expression that will convert these values into the corresponding column values for these columns. Okay, so let me use some aggregate function. Suppose I am going to use max function. Okay, and on top of data we have to use this column, right? So let me preview the data. So basically I can use any of the aggregate function, because since we are grouping it with ID column, so it will be like unique for each of the records, right? So if you see, this ID column that we introduced is unique for this row. So suppose there will be another row, so it will have ID equals to 2. So similarly there will be 5 records having ID equals to 2. So based on the ID we are making this data to be grouped, right? So it will not find out the max of all the record, that is max of all the IDs present. Okay. So suppose ID equals to 2 has this created by ID as 008. So for all the records it won't result in 008 if it is the max value. Okay. Individual to rows that we have, it will give the max value. Okay. So we are good here. Let me preview the data. So you can see our data is looking correct. So these values got converted as the column names. Okay, record ID, created by ID. All these values got converted into column names, and these data present in the data column is the values for these columns. Okay. Now we have to do two things. One is we need to remove this ID column, that is the dummy column that we created, and we have to sort it according to what is the required output. Okay. So for that I am going to use another select transformation, and if you see here it is just determining only one column. Why? Because if you see the output before pivot, it was having ID, data and display name. So we have removed these two columns and we have added other columns. That means these columns, these values has been converted into a column values. So it is not able to determine these newly created columns as the schema for the current transformation. Okay. So it is only generating the previous constant column, that is ID. Okay. So what we need to do here is, let me go back to pivot, and here there is something called map drifted. What it does is it will make all the drifted columns explicitly. Okay. So if I click on it, it will regenerate the schema based on the current transformation. So let me remove this select for now and let me click on this map drifted. So you can see it generated one derive column transformation, and what it is doing is it is converting all these values into proper column values. Okay. Now let me use select transformation, and here let me remove ID column and let me sort these column names based on our requirement. So first of all let me drag record ID to the top. Let me drag this created date time. Then let me use then there is created by, which is fine. Created by ID is fine, and last modified date time. So we are good. Now let me preview the data now. Yeah. So you can see the schema is properly formulated and also our data looks good. Now this data I am going to load it into JSON format so that we will get a proper JSON like structure. Okay. So let me use sync transformation to do that. Okay. And here let me create a new data set pointing to ADLS Gen 2, and JSON is the format I am going to choose, and here let me give the same container, that is Anu demo, for the output file, and in the settings let me select output to single file as the file name option, and here let me provide the file name as output JSON file .json. Okay. Now let me create a pipeline to call this data flow, and let me hit on debug. Let's wait for this data flow execution to be completed. Yeah, so our data flow execution is completed now. Let me go back to Anu demo container, and here let me hit on refresh. Yeah, so you can see output JSON file got generated. Let me check the data and let me compare it with the expected result. So you can see inside this curly braces we are getting record ID, then its value, comma, then created date time and its value created by, then created by ID and last modified date time. So we are good. So this is what our expected data was. So that's it for this video guys. I hope you like the content. I will share this dummy value. I will share the input data in the description of the video so that you can practice by your own. Okay. Please hit on the like button, and also please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet, and also hit on the bell icon to get notification whenever I add videos. Thank you. Please stay tuned.